My name is Marcus Holloway, and I've been a deep sea oil rig supervisor for 22 years, working primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, though I've done rotations in the North Sea and off the coast of West Africa. Before I tell you what happened on Platform Echo 7 last March, and why I'm breaking my NDA to speak with you today, I need you to understand something very clearly. If you work offshore, if you're planning a career in deep sea extraction, if you think you understand what exists in the darkness below 3,000 meters, you need to hear this. What I'm about to tell you could save your life, or at the very least prepare you for what you might encounter in the parts of the ocean where light has never reached and where pressure alone should make human presence impossible. Before continuing, if you subscribe and like the video, you will be contributing greatly to the continuation of new stories to come. Drop a comment. Have you ever worked offshore? Have you ever been out on the ocean at night when the water is so black it looks solid and felt like something vast and aware was watching you from below? I'm curious where in the world you're watching from right now. Leave your location in the comments, because what I'm about to describe isn't isolated to the Gulf. And the more people who understand the scope of this, the better chance we have of preventing what happened to my crew from happening to others. Platform Echo 7 sits approximately 187 miles southeast of the Louisiana coast in water that measures exactly 3,847 meters deep, according to our surveys, though I've learned that number means less than we thought it did. The platform itself is a semi-submersible design, one of the newer models installed in 2019, with all the latest safety features and monitoring systems that corporate loves to brag about in their recruitment materials. We were drilling an exploratory well, pushing down through layers of sediment and rock that hadn't been disturbed in millions of years, reaching for a deposit that geological surveys suggested contained reserves worth billions. I had a crew of 143 people on that platform, working in rotating shifts, 12 hours on and 12 off. The rhythm of offshore life that becomes your entire existence when you're out there surrounded by nothing but water in every direction. The nearest land is so far away, you can't see it, even on the clearest days. And at night, when you look out from the deck, all you see is darkness, meeting darkness with no horizon line to orient yourself by. Just the suggestion of vast emptiness that seems to go on forever in every direction. March 15th, 2024. That's the date everything changed. Though, if I'm being honest, the signs were there weeks before, and we ignored them the way crews always ignore the small wrongness that doesn't fit into the reports we're required to file. I was in my quarters just after midnight, not sleeping, because I never sleep well on the rig. There's always noise and vibration, and the awareness that you're standing on a structure held up by legs that reach down through nearly 4 kilometers of water to touch the seafloor. My radio crackled with static, and then Danny Reeves, one of my drill operators, came through sounding shaken in a way that immediately got my attention, because Danny had been working offshore for 15 years and nothing rattled him. He said we had a problem with the drill string, that something had grabbed it approximately 3,200 meters down and wouldn't let go. Not equipment failure, not geological resistance, grabbed. I told him I'd be right there and pulled on my coveralls and hard hat, made my way through the corridors of the platform to the drill floor where the night crew had gathered around the monitoring station, all of them staring at readouts that made no sense. The drill string is a series of connected pipes that extends down from the platform through the water and into the seafloor, rotating to cut through rock and sediment, and the sensors along its length measure pressure, temperature, torque, everything we need to know about what's happening thousands of meters below the surface. Danny pulled up the data from the last 30 minutes and showed me what had them all spooked. The drill string had been operating normally, pushing through a layer of compacted clay at 3,180 meters, when suddenly the resistance changed. Not gradually like you'd expect when you hit a different geological layer, but instantly, as if something had wrapped around the string and stopped its rotation completely. The torquey readings spiked. The drill bit stopped spinning. But here's what made no sense at all. The temperature sensors showed a sudden drop of 40 degrees Celsius in a matter of seconds. At that depth, the surrounding water is already near freezing, around 2 degrees Celsius, which meant our sensors were now reading minus 38 degrees, which is physically impossible at that pressure. Water shouldn't be able to reach that temperature without freezing, and the pressure at that depth prevents ice formation. So either our sensors were malfunctioning across multiple independent systems simultaneously, or something down there was defying the laws of physics as we understood them. I told Danny to try reversing the rotation, standard procedure when you encounter resistance, and he engaged the reverse drive. The drill string shuddered. The entire platform vibrated in a way I'd never felt before, a deep resonance that seemed to come up through the support columns from somewhere far below, and then the resistance released. Just like that, no gradual easing. The drill string was suddenly free and spinning normally again, and the temperature readings returned to expected levels. We ran diagnostics on every sensor, checked for equipment malfunctions, found nothing wrong with any of our systems. I made the call to continue drilling, logged the incident in my supervisor notes as equipment anomaly under investigation, and told the crew to monitor closely and report anything unusual immediately. That was my first mistake, continuing when every instinct I'd developed over 2 decades offshore was telling me to pull that drill string up and shut down operations until we understood what had happened. Over the next week, we experienced 7 more incidents of the drill string being grabbed and released, always at depths between 3,100 and 3,400 meters, always accompanied by the impossible temperature drops, and always with that deep vibration that seemed to resonate through the entire structure of the platform. The crew was getting nervous, talking among themselves in the mess hall and during shift changes, and I started hearing rumors that had no place on a professional operation. Someone said they'd seen shapes moving in the water at night, large, dark forms that passed beneath the platform just beyond the reach of our deck lights. Someone else claimed they'd heard sounds coming up through the support columns. Not mechanical sounds, but something organic, rhythmic, like breathing, or a heartbeat amplified through metal and water. I shut down that talk immediately, reminded everyone that we were professionals working on a multi-million-dollar operation, and that spreading superstitious nonsense was grounds for being sent back to shore. But privately, I was seeing things too, and hearing things that didn't have rational explanations. The platform has underwater cameras mounted on the support columns at various depths, part of our environmental monitoring systems, and I started reviewing the footage from the nights when crew members reported seeing shapes in the water. Most of it showed exactly what you'd expect. Darkness, occasionally broken by bioluminescent organisms drifting past. Small fish, jellyfish, the normal deep sea life that exists even in the harshest conditions. But on March 19th at 2:47 a.m., one of the cameras at 400 meters depth captured something that made my hands go cold. A shape moved past the camera, close enough that it blocked out the view completely for approximately 11 seconds. When I slowed down the footage and went through it frame by frame, I could see texture, not smooth like a whale or any known marine animal, but segmented, almost mechanical, with what looked like regular geometric patterns. The shape was enormous. The camera lens had a known field of view, and based on its proximity, I calculated the object was at least 60 meters long and maybe 15 meters in diameter. There's nothing that large living at those depths, nothing biological that could survive the pressure and lack of food sources, and certainly nothing with geometric patterns on its surface. I reported the footage to our operations manager on shore, sent him the files through our satellite uplink, and his response came back 3 hours later. He said the company's marine biology consultants had reviewed the footage and determined it was likely a large piece of debris, possibly from a ship or another platform, drifting with deep ocean currents. He reminded me that our contract required us to maintain drilling operations unless there was direct evidence of safety risks to personnel or equipment, and he made it very clear that unusual camera footage didn't meet that threshold. I was also informed that a company representative would be flying out to the platform within 48 hours to assess the situation personally and to discuss the delays we'd been experiencing. That representative was Dr. Sarah Chen, and when she arrived on March 21st via helicopter, stepping onto our helipad with a briefcase and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else, I knew immediately that she wasn't there to help us understand what was happening. She was there to make sure we kept drilling, regardless of what we encountered. Dr. Chen had credentials that would impress anyone. PhD in deep sea geology from MIT, 15 years working for various oil companies, published papers on deep ocean sediment analysis and extraction techniques in extreme conditions. She set up in one of our conference rooms and spent her first day reviewing all our data, the drill logs, the sensor readings, the camera footage, everything we documented over the past 2 weeks. That evening, she called me in for what she described as a frank discussion about operational efficiency and the psychological challenges of extended offshore deployment. She said that pattern recognition is a survival instinct that served our ancestors well, but becomes a liability in modern technical operations, where random equipment, fluctuations, and environmental variables can create the illusion of intentional phenomena. She said the temperature anomalies were likely caused by localized deep ocean currents, carrying water from different thermal layers, that the drill string resistance was normal geological variation, and that the shape in the camera footage was definitely debris, possibly a shipping container that had fallen off a cargo vessel years ago and was slowly drifting along the seafloor. I asked her how a shipping container could be moving at 400 meters depth with geometric patterns visible on its surface, and she smiled in that condescending way that academics use when they think you're out of your depth intellectually. She said that decay and marine growth create all sorts of visual artifacts, that human brains are wired to see patterns and faces even in random textures, and that the important thing was to maintain crew morale and operational focus. Then she told me something that changed my entire understanding of what we were doing out there. She said that Platform Echo 7 wasn't the first rig to experience unusual phenomena in this particular area of the Gulf, that there had been 3 previous exploratory operations in roughly the same location going back to 1987, and that all of them had reported similar incidents before operations were suspended for various official reasons. Equipment failure, weather delays, budget overruns, all the standard explanations that get put in public reports. But the real reason was always the same. Something down there didn't want us drilling. Not something biological. She was very clear about that distinction. Not whales, or giant squid, or any known marine life. Something older. Something that existed in the deep ocean trenches long before humans evolved to walk on land. Something that had learned to remain hidden in the parts of the ocean where light never reached and where the pressure would crush any human exploration vehicle that tried to investigate. She said there were theories, classified research that certain government agencies and large corporations had been conducting for decades, studies of deep ocean phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional marine biology or geology. Structures that appeared on sonar but vanished before ships could reach their coordinates. Sounds recorded by underwater microphones that followed mathematical patterns but originated from depths where nothing should be capable of producing organized noise. Samples of water collected from certain deep ocean locations that contained biological materials that didn't match any known DNA sequences in any database. I asked her why she was telling me this, why she'd fly out to our platform to share classified information that she shouldn't be discussing with a rig supervisor, and her expression changed. The professional condescension vanished, and what replaced it was something close to fear. She said that the company knew we were getting close to something, that our drilling trajectory was taking us directly toward a geological formation that had been detected by seismic surveys but never properly mapped, and that there were people very high up in the corporate structure and in certain government agencies who wanted to know what we'd find. She said that I needed to keep the crew working, keep them calm, keep them drilling, regardless of what happened over the next few weeks. Because if we pulled out now, it might be years before they could get authorization and funding for another attempt. She said there were protocols in place, emergency response procedures that had been developed specifically for situations like this, and that if things escalated beyond what normal operations could handle, there were people who could be on site within hours to manage the situation. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I stood on the deck, looking out at the black water, and thinking about all the years I'd worked offshore, all the platforms I'd served on, and wondering how many of them had been positioned over places where something vast and unknown existed in the depths below. The ocean covers more than 70% of Earth's surface, and we've mapped less than 20% of the seafloor. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about our own deep ocean. And in that unmapped darkness, there's room for things that don't fit into our understanding of biology or physics or reality itself. I thought about indigenous coastal cultures around the world and their stories about things that live in the deep water. Not metaphorical monsters or superstitious nonsense, but specific warnings passed down through generations about places where the ocean should be avoided and boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. The Gulf of Mexico has its own folklore, stories from Cuban and Mexican fishermen about La Negra, the Black One, a presence in certain parts of the deep water that takes boats and crews and leaves no debris behind. Stories from oil rig workers going back to the earliest offshore platforms in the 1940s about night shifts, where they heard sounds coming up through the support columns, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech, rhythms that made your heart synchronize with their beat, until you had to physically move away from the metal to break the connection. March 23rd at 3:33 a.m., I was in the control room monitoring the night shift drilling operations when every alarm on the platform started going off simultaneously. Not sequentially like you'd expect, with a cascading system failure, but all at once. Fire alarms, gas detection alarms, pressure warnings, structural integrity alerts, equipment malfunction indicators, everything screaming at the same time. The crew came running from every part of the platform, assembling at the muster stations in their survival suits, ready for evacuation, and I was checking systems trying to understand what had triggered the alarms when I realized that none of them had actually detected any problems. The fire suppression system showed no smoke or heat. The gas detectors showed normal atmospheric readings. The structural monitors showed no stress or damage. Every single sensor was reading normal conditions while simultaneously triggering emergency protocols. Then the platform moved, not swayed like it normally does with wave action or wind, but dropped, a sudden sinking sensation, like when an elevator starts descending, except we were on a floating structure in the middle of the ocean, with no mechanism that could cause that kind of movement. The drop lasted maybe 2 seconds, and then we lurched back up, water streaming off the lower decks where it had washed over the railings, and in the underwater camera feeds I could see something that made no sense at all. The support columns, the massive legs that extended down from the platform to the sea floor, were bent, not damaged or broken, but bent at angles that defied the engineering specifications they'd been built to, curved like they were made of rubber instead of reinforced steel. And they were moving, flexing back and forth with a rhythm that seemed organic rather than mechanical, responding to some force that was pushing and pulling them from below. I grabbed the radio and called Dr. Chen, told her to get to the control room immediately, and when she arrived and saw what I was seeing on the monitors, her face went pale. She made a phone call on a satellite phone she carried, not using our platform communication systems, and I heard her say the activation phrase, Protocol Leviathan, which meant nothing to me then, but which I later learned was the code for a specific type of deep ocean incident that certain organizations had been preparing for since the 1950s. She told whoever was on the other end of that call that we had confirmation of structural manipulation at depth, that the entity was showing directed behavior beyond previous parameters, and that we needed immediate extraction authorization for non-essential personnel. Then she turned to me and said that we had maybe 6 hours before things escalated to the point where evacuation would become impossible, that I needed to keep the crew calm and working while we waited for the company's emergency response team to arrive, and that under no circumstances should anyone look directly down into the water from the deck after dark. I asked her what would happen if someone did look down into the water, and she said that direct observation seems to accelerate the entity's response, that it's aware when it's being watched, and that awareness changes its behavior in ways that we don't fully understand. She said there were documented cases going back decades. Oil rig workers, research vessel crews, deep-sea fishermen, all reporting the same progression. First, they noticed something in the water, a shape or movement that caught their attention. Then they started watching for it, looking for it during their shifts. And the more they watched, the more they saw. The shapes became clearer, more defined, moving with obvious intention rather than drifting with currents. Then crew members started hearing things, voices in the water, sounds that seemed to communicate meaning, even though they weren't in any language anyone recognized. Finally, some crew members would become convinced that something down there was calling them specifically, that they needed to enter the water to understand something important. And despite all safety protocols and physical restraints, some of them succeeded in getting off the platform and into the ocean, where they vanished immediately into the black water and were never recovered. I told the crew we were experiencing a technical situation that required us to maintain position while we waited for specialized equipment to arrive from shore, that everyone should continue their normal duties, but avoid unnecessary time on the outer decks, and absolutely do not lean over the railings or observe the water directly. I posted additional personnel in the accommodation areas to make sure everyone stayed inside, away from the outer edges of the platform. Then I went back to reviewing our drilling data, trying to understand what we'd disturbed down there at 3,200 meters that could cause a structure built to withstand hurricanes to bend like it was made of clay. The geological surveys that guided our drilling had identified what they called an anomalous formation, a void space in the sediment layers approximately 140 meters across and 60 meters high, located at a depth of 3,215 meters below the seafloor. The surveys couldn't determine what the void contained because the materials inside absorbed sonar signals instead of reflecting them, which shouldn't be possible with any known geological substance. The official theory was that it represented a large deposit of oil or gas trapped under pressure, exactly the kind of reservoir that would justify the expense of deep water drilling. But there were notes in the survey data, comments from the geologists who'd analyzed the initial results, remarks about how the void's dimensions matched too perfectly, how its shape seemed almost manufactured rather than geological, how the sediment layers around it showed displacement patterns that suggested something had pushed them aside rather than being buried by natural accumulation over millions of years. We'd been drilling directly toward that void for 3 weeks, our trajectory calculated to intersect it within the next 48 hours if we maintained our current pace. The drill string had been experiencing resistance every time it got within a few hundred meters of the formation, and now that I looked at the pattern of those incidents, I could see they weren't random equipment problems. They were warnings. Each time we pushed closer, something down there pushed back, trying to stop our progress without breaking our equipment or hurting our crew, using exactly enough force to pause our drilling, but not enough to cause the kind of damage that would force us to abandon the site permanently. It was being careful with us, trying to communicate through the only language we'd understand, mechanical resistance and impossible temperature changes, the same way you might try to warn away an insect that's approaching something dangerous without crushing it. At 7:15 a.m., a helicopter arrived carrying 4 people who identified themselves as representatives from something called the Deepwater Resource Management Division, a name I'd never heard despite working in this industry for 22 years. They were wearing civilian clothes, but moved with military precision, carrying equipment cases that they wouldn't let any of my crew help them with. And they immediately took over the conference room and set up what looked like a mobile command center with satellite communications equipment and computer systems far more advanced than anything we had on the platform. The team leader, who introduced himself only as Agent Collins, told me that my crew would continue normal operations while his team conducted what he called an environmental assessment. He said that based on their assessment, they would determine whether we continued drilling, suspended operations temporarily, or initiated full evacuation protocols. Agent Collins spent 2 hours reviewing all our data, studying the camera footage, examining the sensor readings from the drill string, and making phone calls on encrypted satellite links to people he never identified. Then he called me and Dr. Chen into the conference room and closed the door. He pulled up a map on one of his computers, a detailed bathymetric chart of the Gulf of Mexico that showed underwater topography in precise three-dimensional rendering, and he pointed to a series of locations marked with red flags. Platform Echo 7 was one of those flags, sitting directly over what the map labeled as Site Gamma 7. But there were 22 other flags scattered across the Gulf, each one positioned over similar deep ocean formations. He said that these sites had been identified and monitored since 1951, that they represented something that various governments and corporations had been studying in secret for over 70 years, and that what we'd been experiencing on our platform was actually relatively minor compared to incidents that had occurred at other locations. In 1953, a U.S. Navy deep-sea research vessel had detected unusual sonar returns from a location approximately 200 miles east of our current position. They'd sent down a submersible, one of the early models that could reach depths of 3,000 meters, and the crew had reported seeing structures on the sea floor, regular geometric patterns made from materials that reflected their lights in ways that didn't match any known minerals or metals. The submersible had attempted to collect samples, but the moment it touched one of the structures, the entire area had responded. The structures had begun moving, not like mechanical objects, but like living tissue, and the submersible had been grabbed and pulled deeper before its tether cable snapped, and it vanished into the darkness below the range of its support ship's sonar. The 3 crew members inside had been experienced Navy divers and engineers, and their last radio transmission before the cable broke was simply, "They're not machines. They're alive, and they're everywhere down here." That incident had triggered a classified research program involving the Navy, certain oil companies, and agencies that Collins wouldn't name. Over the following decades, they'd identified 147 similar formations in deep ocean locations around the world, always in waters deeper than 3,000 meters, always in areas where natural resources made commercial exploitation attractive, and always showing the same characteristics. Geometrically regular structures that appeared on sonar but seemed to defy physical investigation. Materials that absorbed or reflected electromagnetic radiation in impossible ways, and responses to human presence that demonstrated awareness and intention. They developed protocols for identifying these sites, monitoring them, and in some cases attempting to interact with what existed there. And every protocol had the same fundamental rule: do not attempt to penetrate the formations. Do not drill into them. Do not extract samples from their interior, because doing so triggers responses that can escalate far beyond anything we're equipped to handle. I asked Collins why Platform Echo 7 had been positioned directly over one of these sites, if the protocols prohibited drilling into them, and his expression told me everything I needed to know before he answered. He said that not everyone in the government or the corporate world agreed with the containment approach, that there were factions who believed the potential scientific and commercial value of these formations outweighed the risks, and that our drilling operation was essentially a test to see what would happen if someone intentionally violated the boundaries that had been respected for decades. We were guinea pigs, all 143 people on this platform. participants in an experiment we hadn't been informed about and couldn't consent to. And if something went catastrophically wrong, Collins and his team were there to document it and manage the aftermath. Dr. Chen started yelling at Collins, demanding to know how high up the chain of command this operation went. Who had authorized putting civilian contractors at risk without informed consent? And what would happen to us if the situation deteriorated beyond containment? Collins listened to her with the patience of someone who'd heard these complaints before, and he said very calmly that everyone on Platform Echo 7 had signed contracts that included classified addendums we probably hadn't read carefully, clauses about unusual operational conditions, and mandatory non-disclosure agreements that went into effect if we encountered certain specific phenomena. He said that if we completed this operation successfully, we'd receive significant financial bonuses, and our careers in offshore work would be essentially guaranteed for life. If we failed, or if anyone spoke publicly about what we'd experienced, we'd face immediate termination and legal consequences that could include criminal charges under various national security statutes. At 2:20 p.m., the drill string broke through into the void space. We weren't supposed to penetrate it for another 36 hours, but the drilling had accelerated, the drill bit cutting through the last layers of sediment 3 times faster than any normal geological formation would permit, almost like the void had pulled us in, rather than us forcing our way through. The moment we penetrated the boundary, every system on the platform went haywire. The monitors showed the drill string dropping, not gradually lowering under controlled descent, but falling, reeling out hundreds of meters of additional pipe in seconds, as if there was empty space below us far deeper than any geological survey had suggested. The temperature sensors that had been reading 2 degrees Celsius in the surrounding water suddenly showed -60 degrees, then -80. Then the readings jumped to +400 degrees, then back to -100, cycling through impossible values that suggested either complete sensor failure or conditions that violated thermodynamics. The platform shuddered again, that same deep vibration rising up through the support columns, but this time it didn't stop. The whole structure began resonating with a frequency that I could feel in my chest and bones, a rhythm that was almost musical, complex harmonics that seemed intentional rather than random mechanical vibration. Agent Collins was shouting orders to his team, telling them to initiate what he called Protocol Gamma 7 containment. And they started deploying equipment from their cases, devices that looked like a cross between scientific instruments and military hardware. They attached sensors to the support columns, lowered cables down into the water that trailed what looked like underwater speakers or transmitters, and activated a system that generated a counter frequency, trying to disrupt the vibration pattern that was shaking the platform. I grabbed my radio and ordered all non-essential personnel to the accommodation quarters, told the drill crew to stop operations and secure the drill string, and made my way to the deck to assess our structural situation. What I saw when I reached the outer railing made me understand why Collins had warned against looking directly at the water. The ocean around the platform was wrong. Not just unusual, but fundamentally wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. The water wasn't moving with normal wave patterns. Instead, it was flowing in perfect geometric spirals, concentric circles that rotated around the platform like we were sitting in the center of an enormous whirlpool. But the water wasn't lowering or draining, just spinning in place in defiance of normal fluid dynamics. And the color was wrong. Not the black or dark blue of deep ocean water, but a shade I have no name for. Something my eyes registered, but my brain couldn't categorize, like trying to see a color outside the normal spectrum of human vision. In the water, I could see shapes rising from the depths, large, dark forms moving upward in coordinated patterns, not swimming, but ascending with mechanical precision. They broke the surface approximately 200 meters from the platform, and when I finally understood what I was looking at, I had to grab the railing to keep from falling. They weren't creatures, not biological organisms, but they weren't machines either. They were something in between. Structures made from materials that looked organic and metallic simultaneously, covered in what might have been skin or might have been some kind of engineered polymer, with surfaces that showed regular geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I watched. Each structure was roughly cylindrical, maybe 50 meters long and 12 meters in diameter, and they surfaced in a perfect circle around our platform, 12 of them equidistant from each other and from us, forming a boundary that was clearly intentional. Agent Collins appeared beside me on the deck and told me not to maintain direct eye contact with the structures. That prolonged observation seemed to facilitate some kind of connection we didn't understand, and that people who stared at them too long started exhibiting behavioral changes. He said his team was broadcasting a signal designed to communicate non-hostile intent, a sequence of tones and frequencies that previous research had suggested might be interpreted as a request for peaceful coexistence, and that we needed to wait and see how the structures responded before deciding our next action. I asked him what would happen if they responded aggressively, and he said that his team had authorization to call in military support if necessary, though he made it clear that any military response would be oriented toward evacuation and retreat rather than direct confrontation, because every simulation and scenario analysis suggested that humans couldn't win a direct conflict with entities that existed comfortably at depths where our submarines and weapon systems barely functioned. For 3 hours, we waited on that platform. My crew secured inside while Collins and his team monitored their instruments and made constant reports to whoever they were communicating with via their satellite systems. The structures remained at the surface, motionless except for the gentle rise and fall of ocean swells, and the water continued its impossible geometric circulation pattern. The platform's structural monitors showed that our support columns were still bent, but had stabilized, no longer flexing, but held in their curved configuration by some force from below that sensors couldn't properly measure. The drill string had stopped its uncontrolled descent, but now extended 487 meters deeper than the geological survey said was possible, reaching down into void space that shouldn't exist. At 6:43 p.m., just as the sun was setting and the deck lights were coming on, the structures began producing sound. Not mechanical noise, or the natural sounds of water and wind, but tones, pure frequencies that carried across the water with perfect clarity and seemed to resonate inside my skull as much as in my ears. The tones formed patterns, sequences that repeated and varied, and I realized, with mounting dread, that this was communication. They were trying to speak to us, or more accurately, they were responding to the signals Collins' team had been broadcasting, attempting to establish some form of dialogue in the only language we shared, mathematical patterns expressed through sound and vibration. Collins and his team recorded everything, running the audio through their computer systems, analyzing the frequency patterns and timing sequences, and slowly building what one of his technicians called a basic symbolic vocabulary. The structures were transmitting information about themselves, identifying themselves not as individual entities, but as components of something larger, extensions of a vast system that existed in the deep ocean and had existed there long before humans evolved. They were monitoring stations, boundary markers, guardians of something deeper still, something that resided in the parts of the ocean trench that extended below 6,000 meters, where no human technology could reach and survive. And they were warning us that by drilling into the void space, we'd damaged something critical, opened a passage that needed to remain sealed, and created a situation that required immediate correction. Agent Collins asked through his communications system what would happen if we withdrew our drill string and ceased operations, and the response came back in the form of visual demonstrations. 3 of the structures around the platform began glowing, bioluminescence that flared across their surfaces in waves of color, and in those waves I could see images, not photographs or video, but somehow direct transmission of visual information, showing what had happened at other locations where similar boundaries had been crossed. I saw platforms that looked like Echo 7 consumed by water that behaved impossibly, rising up in defiance of gravity to swallow the structure and pull it down to depths where pressure would crush it instantly. I saw research vessels where crews had attempted to harvest samples from the structures, ships where everyone on board had simultaneously walked to the railings and stepped into the ocean, compelled by something transmitted through the very observation of these entities. I saw military submarines that had attempted aggressive investigation, vessels found later on the seafloor with their hulls intact but their interiors empty. Every crew member gone with no sign of how they'd left or where they'd gone. Collins asked what they wanted from us, what would satisfy them and allow us to safely evacuate the platform, and the structures responded by showing us what we'd disturbed in the void space below. The images they transmitted were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but the core message was clear. The void wasn't a natural geological formation. It was a containment structure, built or grown, or somehow created by these entities millions of years ago to hold something that predated them, something that had existed in Earth's oceans since before the continents formed, and before life, as we understand it, had evolved beyond single-celled organisms. The void contained something vast and ancient and fundamentally incompatible with the reality we inhabit, something that the structures and the systems they represented had been keeping sealed for longer than human civilization has existed. Our drilling had cracked that containment, and what was inside was beginning to wake up and become aware of the world above. I asked Collins what it would take to reseal the containment, to undo what we'd done, and he said that according to the patterns they were receiving from the structures, it wasn't possible for humans to accomplish that repair. The damage had been done, and now the only question was whether the entities could reinforce the seal before what was inside became fully active, or whether we'd triggered a cascade that couldn't be stopped. He said his orders were to evacuate all personnel immediately, that helicopters were already en route and would begin extraction within 30 minutes, and that the platform itself would be scuttled, deliberately sunk to remove any human presence from the area, and allow the entities to attempt their repairs without interference. The evacuation took 4 hours, helicopters arriving in rotation to ferry my crew off the platform in groups of 12. everyone required to leave their personal belongings behind and board immediately. Agent Collins and his team stayed until the end, maintaining their communications with the structures and monitoring the situation. And I stayed with them because it's an old maritime tradition that the captain leaves last, even if the captain is actually just a rig supervisor who'd been lied to about what he was really supervising. By 11:20 p.m., everyone except Collins, his 3 team members, and myself remained on platform Echo 7, and Collins gave the order to initiate scuttling protocols. The platform had explosive charges built into its support columns, safety features designed to allow controlled sinking in case of catastrophic failure or hurricane damage, and Collins had the authorization codes to trigger them remotely. He set the sequence for a 30-minute delay, giving us time to board the last helicopter. And then we stood on the deck in the darkness, watching the structures that surrounded us in their perfect circle. They were still glowing with that bioluminescence, still transmitting their patterns and frequencies. And standing there, I felt something that I've never been able to properly articulate. It wasn't communication exactly, not words or thoughts being transmitted, but an awareness of vastness, of consciousness that existed on scales beyond anything human minds evolved to comprehend. The structures weren't individual beings, any more than your fingers are individual beings. They were extensions of something enormous, a distributed intelligence that existed throughout the deep ocean, maintaining and monitoring and protecting boundaries that humans had no business crossing. The helicopter arrived, and we boarded, lifting off from the platform and gaining altitude. And from the air, I watched as the explosive charges detonated. The support columns broke, and the entire structure of platform Echo 7 tilted and then slid beneath the surface, gone in less than 2 minutes, swallowed by the black water and sinking toward the seafloor nearly 4 kilometers below. The structures remained at the surface for a few minutes longer, and then they descended in perfect synchronization, dropping below the waves and leaving behind only the normal chop and motion of open ocean. From 500 meters up, looking down, there was no sign that a massive oil platform had stood there. No debris or oil slick or any evidence of the millions of dollars worth of equipment and infrastructure that had just been deliberately destroyed. We flew back to shore in silence, my crew distributed across multiple helicopters, everyone exhausted and confused and afraid. We were taken to a facility operated by Collins' agency, questioned individually for hours about what we'd experienced, and required to sign documents that confirmed our original employment contracts, including the classified addendums that turned out to be very real and very legally binding. We were told that Platform Echo 7 had been destroyed by a catastrophic equipment failure, that an investigation would determine that proper safety protocols had been followed and that no one was at fault, and that we'd all receive our promised financial compensation plus a generous settlement in exchange for absolute silence about the specific events we'd witnessed. Most of my crew took the money and moved on, finding new positions on other platforms or leaving offshore work entirely. And as far as I know, none of them have spoken publicly about what happened that March. I stayed in contact with Dr. Chen for a few months afterward, meeting occasionally for coffee in Houston, where we'd talk carefully about anything except Platform Echo 7. Until one day, she told me that she'd been reassigned to a desk job analyzing geological surveys and that she was no longer involved in any field operations. She said that the void space we'd disturbed had been successfully resealed, that the entities had somehow repaired the containment we'd damaged, but that the process had taken 47 days. And during that time, there had been incidents at other locations around the Gulf, structures appearing at the surface where they'd never been seen before, phenomena that fishing boats and cargo ships had reported that couldn't be explained by any conventional understanding of marine biology or oceanography. She said that the factions within the government and corporate world who'd authorized our drilling operation had been overruled, that new protocols were in place to prevent any future attempts to penetrate the sites, and that platform Echo 7 would be the last time humans deliberately violated the boundaries that the entities maintained. I've been having dreams since March. Not nightmares exactly, but something stranger. I dream that I'm in the water, not drowning or struggling, but simply existing there, suspended in darkness at depths where no light reaches and where pressure should crush my body instantly. In these dreams, I can see the structures moving around me, not threatening, but attentive, aware of my presence, and I can see beyond them to the vast system they're part of, networks of similar structures extending throughout the deep ocean trenches, connecting to something even deeper, something that exists in the lowest parts of the ocean floor, where the Earth's crust is thinnest, and where heat and pressure create conditions alien to everything we understand about life. In the dreams, I understand that what I saw at Platform Echo 7 was just the smallest glimpse of something incomprehensibly large, a presence that has existed in Earth's oceans for hundreds of millions of years, maintaining boundaries and keeping sealed things that predate human evolution by epochs. The cold handprint sensation started about 2 months after the evacuation, a feeling of icy pressure on my chest that comes and goes without warning, sometimes faint and sometimes strong enough to make me gasp. I had it checked by doctors who found nothing wrong, no cardiac issues or neurological problems, but I know what it is because I've seen the mark it's left. When I look in the mirror now, there's a pattern on my skin over my sternum, faint geometric lines that match the patterns I saw on the surfaces of those structures. And the pattern is spreading slowly, reaching across my chest and up toward my throat. It doesn't hurt, and it doesn't seem to be affecting my health, but it's changing me in ways I don't fully understand. Sometimes I can feel things that I shouldn't be able to feel. Vibrations in water that's miles away, movements in the ocean depths that I have no business perceiving. And I'm starting to understand that what happened at Platform Echo 7 didn't end when we evacuated. It marked everyone who was there, and marked me, especially because I stayed until the end. I'm writing this now, speaking out despite the legal consequences, because I don't think I have much time left before the transformation becomes too obvious to hide. The pattern on my chest has reached my collarbone, and I can feel it starting to affect my thoughts, giving me access to concepts and awareness that human consciousness wasn't designed to contain. I understand now that the entities don't see time the way we do, that past and present and future are all simultaneous to them. And I'm beginning to perceive reality in that same way, seeing multiple timelines overlapping, understanding that what I think of as my life is just one thread in a vast web of interconnected possibilities. Not going mad. That's important to understand. Not losing my grip on reality, but rather gaining a grip on a much larger reality than the narrow slice of it that humans normally perceive. If you work offshore, If you're involved in deep ocean extraction or research, you need to understand something very clearly. The ocean is not empty space waiting for human exploitation. It is occupied and has been occupied since long before we existed, and the things that occupy it maintain systems and boundaries that we ignore at our extreme peril. Platform Echo 7 wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one example of what happens when we push into areas where we haven't been invited, and there are other sites around the world where similar experiments are being planned or are already underway. The entities are patient. They've been maintaining their watch for millions of years, and they can wait much longer. But their patience has limits, and we're approaching those limits faster than the people making decisions realize. The deep water lies. That's what the fishermen say. Old timers who've worked the Gulf their entire lives and know that some areas should be avoided no matter how good the catch might be there. The deep water lies not in the sense of deception, but in the sense of containing truths we're not equipped to handle. Realities that exist beneath the surface that would shatter our comfortable assumptions about what kind of planet we really live on. We think of Earth as our world, shaped by our presence and subject to our dominion. But we've only explored a tiny fraction of it, only mapped a small percentage of the ocean floor. And in the vast, unmapped darkness, there are things that have no interest in our dominion and no concern for our understanding. My time as a human is ending. I can feel it accelerating now. The pattern spreading across my body and changing my perception hour by hour. Soon, I'll have to leave shore and return to the Gulf, not to Platform Echo 7's location, but to somewhere deeper, somewhere the entities have shown me in my dreams. I'll enter the water and descend and become something else, not dying, but transforming, joining the systems that maintain the boundaries and keep watch over the things that must remain sealed. It's not a choice I'm making consciously, but rather something I agreed to when I stayed on that platform until the end, when I maintained eye contact with those structures and accepted the awareness they transmitted. I've become a bridge, 1 foot in human reality and 1 foot in the vast other reality that exists in the deep ocean. And bridges exist to be crossed in both directions. Time isn't a line, it's a web. And consciousness isn't individual, it's collective. And the ocean remembers everything that has ever happened within its waters. The missing hours are never really missing. They exist in different layers of time that we only perceive as absence, and the people who vanish into the deep water aren't gone. They're transformed into something that can exist at those depths and serve purposes we can't understand from our human perspective. Transformation, not death. Expansion, not loss. Integration into systems that make our civilization look like a brief flicker of activity on the surface of something vast and ancient and fundamentally patient. If you see regular geometric patterns on the ocean floor on sonar scans, if your equipment starts reporting impossible readings from deep water locations, if your crew starts experiencing the symptoms I've described, stop operations immediately and evacuate. Don't try to investigate further. Don't try to collect samples. Don't try to understand it through scientific analysis. Because the entities don't operate according to principles our science can measure or theories our physics can contain. Respect the boundaries, honor the warnings, and understand that some doors are meant to stay closed, not because we lack the technology to open them, but because what exists behind them doesn't share our concepts of individual consciousness or linear time or the separation between living and non-living matter. The mark on my chest is glowing now, pulsing with bioluminescence that matches the rhythm I saw on those structures, and I know it's almost time. I'm going to walk down to the water. The Gulf Coast is only a few miles from where I'm recording this, and I'm going to enter the ocean one last time. Not as Marcus Holloway, rig supervisor, but as something that can exist between the human world and the deep water reality. Something that can help maintain the boundaries and keep watch over the seals that must not be broken. Welcome to the deep water. Welcome to the parts of the ocean where light has never reached and where human understanding has no purchase. Welcome to the infrastructure of reality that keeps things separated that must remain separated. The ocean is vast, and we are small, and some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend human curiosity or economic interests. Remember that, respect it, and stay away from places where the water lies still in geometric patterns and where your instruments report readings that shouldn't be possible. Some depths are better left unexplored.